You've probably already seen several videos about the Insta360 Go 3, but this one's going to be a little bit different. You see, unlike most of the reviewers out there, Insta360 did not send me this for free. I purchased it with my own money. So let's do a completely honest and unbiased review of the Insta360 Go 3, what's good, what's not so good, and is it the right camera for you? Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really good videos out there on the Go 3 that provide some really useful information. But let's be honest, if a company provides you with equipment free of charge, that's going to have an influence on your final reviews. And you're probably going to hold back on any strong criticism, particularly if you want to continue to receive equipment from that manufacturer. So let me just re-emphasize, I have absolutely no connection at all with Insta360 or for that matter any camera manufacturer. I purchased this with my own money and the opinions are entirely my own. So the Go 3 has been on the market for about a year now. And when it first came out, I wasn't that sold on it. I thought the price was a bit high at over $400, especially for a camera with specifications that lag considerably behind its competitors. But over the course of the last year, a few things changed. First of all, they made it in this very attractive black design, which I just find is better looking, and also it's far less conspicuous for first-person viewing, in most cases when you're wearing the right kind of clothing. Also, we've seen some discounting on the Go 3, more on that in just a moment. And the third thing which really tipped the scales for me is when we were watching a commercial for it and my wife said, "Hey babe, you should get one of these." And so here it is. So there is a lot to cover, so I'm going to place the chapters up here and on the video timeline. And before we get into it, please remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more content on the Go 3 and other similar cameras. So let's get on with it. Now, I don't want to go through all the specifications here, but suffice to say that when you compare the Go 3 to a typical action camera like a GoPro, the specifications are definitely more limited. So for example, the video resolution maxes out at 2.7K. When it comes to shooting higher frame rates, you can really only shoot up to 50 frames per second, and that's by reducing the resolution down to 1440p. There's also a dedicated slow motion mode which offers 120 frames per second, but that involves reducing the resolution even further down to 1080p. When it comes to stills, they max out at around about 6 megapixels. When it comes to time lapses, here too you're limited to 1440p resolution, and so on and so on. So these specifications don't look so great when you compare it to other action cameras, but of course the Go 3 is not a typical action camera. Now, when you look at it like this in the action pod, of course it looks just like any other action camera, like a small version of a GoPro, for example. But what you have to consider is this is not the camera. This is the camera. So all of those features, the video modes, the time-lapse mode, things like timed recording, loop recording, pre-recording, all these capabilities are built into this tiny little form factor. And it's this that really is the selling point of this camera. If you compare this to your typical action camera, you can imagine that this is going to fit in places that this simply will not fit, or even if it would fit, it's going to be significantly more difficult, complex, and cumbersome in order to do so. For example, I can just simply snap this onto the magnetic pendant. If I want to do a first-person view, I can snap it onto this little adapter here and clip it onto a cap, my pet's collar, or other location. I can snap it onto the included quick release mount, and then I can stick this pretty much anywhere, and you can see how easy it is to deploy this camera. So when you buy a Go 3, the first decision you have to make is which version are you going to get. Now, of course, it comes in both black and white, but the big decision really is which storage capacity are you going to need. You see, the Go 3 does not have a memory card slot. All the memory is on board, so you need to make sure you get the correct capacity for your needs. Now, it comes in 3 different capacities: 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, and 128 gigabytes. So the question is, which one do you need? Now, the Go 3 records at a maximum of up to 80 megabits per second, but I did some testing, and as it turns out, when you're recording in standard video at 2.7K, it's actually only writing at around about 45 megabits per second. Now, you may not be interested in the bit rate, so let's just get straight to the point. If you do the math on the 32 gig version, you're going to get around about 82 minutes of storage time. On the 64 gig version, you'll get almost 3 hours of recording time. And on the 128, you'll get over 5.5 hours of recording time if you're recording standard video at 2.7K. Now, if you like to record in the free frame mode, this is the mode that uses the full 80 megabit per second bitrate. So if you're using that mode frequently, you're going to have to pretty much halve those expected recording times. So that works out to about 45 minutes on the 32 gig version, about an hour and a half on the 64 gig version, and about 3 hours on the 128 gig version. As far as pricing is concerned, if you take a look at the list pricing, the 32 gig version at $380, the 64 gig version at $400, and the 128 gig version at $430, frankly, I find these a little bit on the expensive side. But as I mentioned earlier, recently we've seen a lot of discounting. Now, the pricing tends to go up and down quite a lot, and occasionally you'll find that the version you want is not in stock. But if you're patient, you should be able to find the 64 gig version for $320 and the 128 version for $340, which I think is a much more realistic price. So regardless of which version you choose, this is basically what comes in the box. Obviously there is also a USB cable and some paperwork, but this is the main stuff right here. So of course you have the camera. It comes with a lens protector already installed, and you have the action pod, and we'll talk more about these later on. In addition, you get these 3 different mounting solutions. Now, this is a really nice addition because it covers pretty much everything you're going to want to do in order to mount your Go 3. Starting with the pendant. So this, basically you hang around your neck, the cord winds into it, which is a nice new touch. You put it behind your shirt, and then you simply click on the camera like this for an easy first-person view. It also comes with this little wedge, so you can actually adjust the angle to get the exact angle that you want. Secondly, we have what's called the Easy Clip. So this has a little clip for putting it onto a cap. You can put it on your pet's collar, and I'm sure there's all sorts of creative things you could do with this. The camera just drops in here, snaps in magnetically, and again, I'm sure there's plenty of creative things you could do with this particular mount. And thirdly, we have the pivot stand. So as the name suggests, this has a quick release mount on a ball head that you can position pretty much in any orientation. The camera snaps onto it, and it locks in place. So this will not come off unless you activate the little mechanism here. And once it's on here, as I said, you can then position this anyhow you want. It has a sticky base on it, so you can then mount it to any flat surface. And after a while, if this starts to lose its stickiness, you can simply wash it off and it will be pretty much like new again. The pivot stand also, if you unscrew the sticky pad, has a standard 1/4" mount, so you can place this on the end of a selfie stick, on a tripod, or other kind of mount. So as I say, with these three things, you pretty much have all of your mounting solutions covered. So let's take a closer look at the camera itself and the basics of how we operate it. So as you can see, I have the camera placed inside the action pod right now. Anytime you put it in, if it needs a charge, you can see the little red light comes on to show that it's being charged from the action pod. In this configuration, it looks, feels, and works pretty much like any other action camera. On this end, we have a power button, which when I press it will power on both the camera and the action pod. Now this is important to mention because this is the same even if the camera is outside of the action pod. If you hit the power button, it will turn on both devices. Also, there's another button on the side here which is used for changing your recording mode. You can also use it to switch between different presets. There are some that come on the camera, and you can also add your own presets. On the other end of the camera, we have a release button for the camera, more on that in a second, and then we have a USB-C port which is used for both charging and transferring files to a computer. On the back, of course, we have the touchscreen. It's a really nice touchscreen, very clear, very responsive. And it also has the very useful feature of being able to flip it up, so you can then use it in a selfie mode. So overall operation, as I said, is pretty much like any standard action camera, and that's also true if you remove the camera from the action pod. So it continues to operate even outside. It's now communicating using Bluetooth. You will notice there is a bit of a lag, and also you should know that the range of this remote is about 5 meters, after which you will lose the signal. Obviously, if your camera is recording, it will continue to record, but you will no longer have the live view, and of course you'll no longer be able to change any of the settings as long as you're out of range. Now, it's also possible to operate the camera standalone just on its own. There is a single button on the front. Pressing it one time will power on the camera. Once it's powered on, a single press will start recording in the standard video mode, and of course pressing it again will stop it. You can also double press it to start recording in the free frame mode, and again a single press will stop that recording, and a long press will power off the camera. Now you can also choose which modes you want for the single and double press recording modes, and there is also a quick start mode which, if enabled, a single press on the power button will power up the camera and begin recording immediately in whatever mode you have selected. And one final thing to mention here, the camera in this configuration is completely waterproof down to a depth of 5 meters. The action pod is not waterproof, it is just water resistant, and it is only water resistant assuming you have the camera located in place. So as we discussed earlier, in order to make this camera so small, Insta360 have had to make a few sacrifices when it comes to the overall specifications. So I figured it would be a good idea to run some basic comparison tests to see just how much of a sacrifice that is. Now for my comparison, the action camera I chose is this guy, the GoPro Hero 10. Now I could tell you that I chose this one because it represents the baseline of what's available out there in terms of action cameras, or because it has a very similar sized sensor to the Go 3, but the main reason is because this is the only normal action camera that I own, so this is going to be the one we're going to use for our comparison. Now, it's important to mention that the Hero 10 is an older camera. It was released at the end of 2021, whereas the Go 3 was released mid-2023. So there's about an 18-month gap between the release of these two cameras. That being said, the Hero 10 obviously has much higher specifications. It's able to record video up to 5.3K, which is what we're going to be using in our testing, versus the 2.7K on the Go 3. So let's do some comparison testing. Okay, so let's do our first test in the studio here. I have both cameras set to their optimum conditions, so that would be 5.3K on the GoPro and 2.7K on the Go 3. Now I'm not going to tell you which one is which just yet. Let's just say that the camera on my right is camera A, the camera on my left is camera B, and I'll leave it for you to decide which you think has the best image quality and which you think is the Go 3 versus the GoPro. Now, as far as the audio is concerned, we're using the onboard microphones of both cameras. Right now you're listening to me through the onboard microphones of camera A. How is the sound quality? Maybe I'll switch over and continue with the onboard microphones of camera B. Now, as far as the settings are concerned, I have everything pretty much set to auto. I have the standard color profiles active. I have the sharpness set to normal. I have turned off stabilization because of course we are mounted on a tripod here. And I have the bitrate on both set to high for the highest possible image quality. Let's switch back over to the onboard microphones of camera A to give you once again a comparison of the two. And just finally, let's switch back over to camera B so you can hear the difference between the two microphones. Okay, so for our next test, let's do a little bit of walking and talking. I have adjusted the settings a little bit on both cameras, so I now have stabilization turned on at its lowest setting. I also have the wind reduction enabled on both because there is a little bit of wind going right now. So once again, what are your thoughts? Which one has the better image quality, camera A on my right or camera B on my left? Let's also do a comparison of the audio quality. So right now I'm talking to you on the onboard cameras of camera B. Let's switch over to camera A and compare the difference between the two. How does it sound now on camera A? Let's switch back over to camera B to get another comparison. What is the audio quality like now? Let's switch back over to camera A so you can get a comparison of the two. Okay, and let's just try shooting a little bit of B-roll here just to give you an idea of the overall image quality. Also, I have stabilization turned up a little higher now on both, so if I just take a little bit of a jog, you can get an idea of how good the image quality is in combination with some stabilization. Let's see how well they handle changes in light. If I point up here towards the sun a little bit, let's see how they handle that. And point back down to the shadows. So, some pretty mixed and interesting results, I would say. So, what did you guys think? Which one had the best image quality? Which had the best audio quality? And of course, which camera do you think was which? Please go ahead and drop your comments into the comments section. Now, from my perspective, having looked over these clips a couple of times and compared them, so when it comes to test number 1, the studio test, I think that one was pretty clear. Camera B did a much better job, while camera A really struggled with the exposure, overexposing the image, and you could see a significant amount of noise in the dark parts of the image. Moving outside to the walk and talk test, definitely camera A redeemed itself. I think in that particular test, overall you saw better image detail both on the subject and the surroundings on camera A. And thirdly, in our B-roll test, I thought these results were pretty mixed. Here too, we saw better detail on camera A, but camera B did the better job when it comes to exposing the images, showing better colors throughout, even under challenging lighting conditions. As far as the audio is concerned, let's be honest, these tiny microphones on tiny cameras generally don't provide great results, and this was really no exception. Obviously, in the studio test and the walk and talk test, I stayed pretty close to the camera, and I think in this kind of situation, the audio quality is acceptable and pretty usable. That being said, I do think that camera A had a slightly better tone. It was a little fuller and richer. Camera B, particularly indoors, sounded a little bit light and echoey. So, which camera do you think was which? Well, if you haven't guessed already, then camera A was the GoPro and camera B was the Go 3. Now, to be honest, I was not expecting the Go 3 to perform as well as it did in this comparison test. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with the image quality, even though we're operating at lower resolutions. Now, it is important to re-emphasize that the camera I was comparing it to is a relatively old camera, but it is still being sold as a new camera by GoPro currently. So again, I was pretty impressed that the Go 3 was able to hold its own against one of the most popular action cameras out there. So let's talk about what is not so good with the Insta360 Go 3. And the first thing I want to talk about is an external microphone, or to be more specific, the complete lack of any possibility to add an external microphone. Now, this decision is pretty surprising to me because when you look at pretty much every camera that Insta360 has released over the past 3 or 4 years, every single one of them has the ability to attach an external microphone. And there are two options in order to be able to do this. You can add it through the USB port, and of course Insta360 tends to use adapters, which I'm not a fan of, but it's still an option. The other option is to use Bluetooth, and we know this thing has Bluetooth on board, so I simply don't understand why they would not enable that feature on the Go 3. We heard in our tests earlier that audio quality from these onboard microphones is okay, but it's not great, and that's of course assuming that you're in close proximity to the camera. Obviously, being able to add an external microphone will improve your audio quality and allow you to move further from the camera and still be able to get your voice on the soundtrack. And also don't forget that the Go 3 has voice control. So here too, having an external microphone, even when you're a little further from the camera, gives you additional possibilities to control the camera. The next thing that is not so great on the Go 3 is the inability to charge or power the camera unless it's in the action pod. Now, according to Insta360, you get up to 45 minutes of runtime, and that's assuming you're running in 1080p resolution. I'll definitely be running some tests to see exactly how long I can get. But what if you want to get longer run times? What if you want to place this in a location and have it do loop recording over a long period in order to capture something specific? Wouldn't it be nice to have a USB-C port directly on the camera itself, allowing you to charge and power the camera when it's not in the action pod? And I can think of all kinds of situations where that would be very useful. Also, just if you're out and about using this periodically and you don't want to have to carry the action pod with you, you're going to run out of battery at some point and there's no way to recharge it until you get back to the action pod. Another benefit of a USB-C port on the camera would be that you would now be able to transfer files directly from the camera to a computer, again without the action pod. Now, obviously you can use the app on your smartphone and you can transfer files to your smartphone, but this takes quite a bit of time to do. You're probably not going to do this for very large files or if you have lots of files. And of course, the whole time you're connected to your smartphone, you're also draining the battery of the camera. Complaint number 3 is about having onboard memory versus using a memory card. Now, I get it and I understand why they've gone down this path, but it does make a few disadvantages. Now, assuming you get the 128 gig version, and I would definitely advise that you don't buy the 32 gig version, maybe the 64, but even with the 128, 5.5 hours of recording time at 2.7K, that sounds like a lot. And if you exercise good file management, if you transfer files and delete them off the camera, you'll probably never have an issue. But many of us don't exercise good file management, and that's why all of our cell phones are filled up with pictures and we occasionally have to go in and start deleting them. Now, if you're the type of user that typically transfers files over to a computer and works on them on the computer, then it probably won't be an issue as much, because when you do that, you can then delete the files directly off once they're successfully transferred. If, however, you're the type of person who likes to use the app, you edit your file, you share it to social media, very, very rarely do you actually delete the original recording. And sooner or later, your camera is going to be full. And when that happens, you have to go in and try to figure out which files you need to keep and which you don't. Being able to use memory cards obviously adds to your overall flexibility. You can use smaller or larger cards depending on your project. If you're shooting and you get some really amazing footage, you can take out the card and secure it somewhere, put in a new card and start again, making sure you've safeguarded what you've already captured. So if I combine this with the previous complaint, what I'd really like to see on the next version is a little water-sealed hatch here, behind which you'll find both a micro SD card slot and a USB-C port. And on the subject of USB-C ports, that brings me to my next complaint, and that is the use of USB 2.0. I assume it's USB 2.0 because I ran some speed tests, and when transferring files it runs at 25 megabytes per second. So let's say, for example, you go on a trip, you come home, and you have about 50 gigabytes of files to transfer over to your computer. With this connection, it's going to take you about 30 to 40 minutes to transfer those files over. And the final complaint I have is about the communication between the camera and the action pod. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a great solution. It really is well implemented. It is completely seamless in terms of the operation, but it does have two issues which are basically a result of the communication type. You see, from what I understand, the communication is Bluetooth, even when it's sitting in the action pod. And that's why you'll see, even in the action pod, there's a bit of a delay, and when you take the camera out of the action pod and get further away, that delay gets worse. If you're standing at around about the 5-meter mark where you still have communication, you'll probably see a good second of delay between what's happening in front of the camera and when you see it on the screen. The other issue is, of course, that it's very easy to drop the signal altogether. So 5 meters is not very far, and you'll find that if there is the slightest obstruction, even a window, that can be greatly reduced. So you may experience quite a few dropouts of the connection. Now, if you use the smartphone app, on the other hand, the communication is by Wi-Fi. So the delay is minimal. Even at distance, the delay is minimal, and you can go much further away. You can even go round corners and behind walls and maintain the connection to the camera. So for the best remote connectivity, the app is the better way to go, but do keep in mind that connecting by Wi-Fi will drain the battery faster. Now, on the subject of the app, one thing I do need to give Insta360 kudos for is now with the app, you can actually wake up the camera even when it's out of the action pod in order to control it, which is a very useful new feature. But there's one little complaint I have here, and that is when I'm using the app with this in standard video mode and I turn it this way, I kind of expect the orientation of the screen to change and fill my screen. So that's maybe one little thing you guys could address. So let's try to answer the question, is this the right camera for you? Well, let's start out with a pretty easy scenario. If you have multiple cameras and you enjoy taking multiple cameras on your vacations, your trips, your excursions, your adventures, then absolutely this is a camera for you. It offers you creative possibilities that you simply do not have with other cameras. And you'll also find yourself taking this camera out and using it in situations where you could use another camera, but you simply don't because it's just too much of a hassle to set it up. Now, if you are in the situation where you're trying to decide between buying the Go 3 versus some other action camera, then of course that is going to depend heavily on the type of video shooting that you plan on doing with it. For example, if you plan on doing some vlogging, if you plan on taking location footage from the places you are visiting on your trips or adventures, and in doing so, the camera remains pretty much the entire time in the action pod, then this is not the camera for you. Even though we saw it compare very favorably to the GoPro Hero 10, there are much more modern action cameras out there from GoPro, from DJI, and also from Insta360, and those cameras will definitely give you better quality on the image, better quality audio. They're a lot more flexible. You can exchange the batteries, you can exchange memory cards, you can add peripherals including external microphones. So those type of cameras are going to give you better results. However, if you plan on making use of this functionality, taking the camera out, putting it into locations that other cameras simply would not fit, then this might just be the right camera for you. And there's also another saying that comes to mind, that the best camera is the one you have with you. And clearly this is one camera that you can always have with you and is so simple to get out and start recording with. You can simply snap it onto your chest, you can put it onto your hat, you can put it onto the pivot stand and simply stick it somewhere and start recording. These are the types of shots that for other cameras require planning, require setup, and very often you might even just miss the opportunity. So in short, if you can take advantage of this tiny little form factor and its ease of deployment, then absolutely the Go 3 could be a good choice for you. So when I was planning this video, I was pretty much expecting that the Go 3 would be a lot of fun, but ultimately that its image quality would be what let it down. And I was pleasantly surprised, and I can honestly say that that is not the case. As you saw, it compared very favorably against the GoPro, albeit a Hero 10, a somewhat older model. But just taken on its own merits, I think the Go 3 provides very good video quality, and I certainly look forward to playing around with this and getting some creative type shots with it. So that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got some good information out of today's video. If so, please remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel. If you have any questions, any comments, if you want to share your experience, please go ahead and drop those into the comments section. Otherwise, thank you again for watching.